As Amina worked as a waitress on a cruise, she stopped in her tracks when she saw the rich man sitting at one of the tables. It was Kofi, her late husband, who she thought had died 7 years before. As she slowly walked toward him, her heart was racing because she was so shocked. Is it really him? She had just started to put her life back together after Kofi's death, and now he was back, living and well. Amina had never been so lost or stressed out. When she found out she was pregnant, it turned her quiet life upside down in the best way possible. Twins. She and Kofi had always talked about starting a family, but this was even better than they had imagined. As Amina sat in their warm mud brick village house, she thought about how pleased Kofi had been when she told him the news. His face was a mix of shock and pure happiness, and his eyes were bright. He asked, "Twins?" with an emotional voice as he ran his hand through his neatly cut hair. "2 babies." Amina nodded and smiled so big that it hurt her face. She couldn't hold back her joy and said, "Yes." "Can you believe it?" Kofi shook with happiness as he pulled her into a tight hug. "Amina, I can't believe this. This is everything we ever wanted." They felt like they were on top of the world at that moment. Things looked great in their small, simple country life. They only had a small mud and thatch house tucked away among the acacia trees, but it was theirs. They both worked hard. And while they didn't have much material wealth, they had each other and the family they had always wanted. The following week was like yesterday in Amina's mind. They had been talking about nursery themes, baby names, and how their lives would change the whole time. Kofi joked that he would learn how to change 2 diapers at once, and Amina was making lists of things she needed for the baby. It didn't matter that they didn't know how they were going to pay for everything. They were glad. Then it was cruelly taken away, just as quickly as their happiness had come. The call came in late at night, just as the sun was going down, lighting up their small living room with a golden glow. Kofi went out to run an errand and get some things for dinner, while Amina stayed at home and rested her hand on her still flat stomach. It was the future, and she was picturing their babies running around the yard when the phone rang. It was strange. By then, Kofi should have been at home. "Hello," she asked, her voice calm because she didn't know the storm was coming. "Mrs. Amina?" The voice on the other end was formal and cut off. "Yes, that's her." "Who's calling?" she asked. The voice kept calling. "I'm calling about your husband, Kofi Mensah." There was a short pause that made Amina's heart sink. I didn't understand what those words meant at first. There has been an accident? Kofi? It had been hard for her to put the pieces together. He had just gone grocery shopping, so how could something go wrong? The voice kept going, though, and filled the quiet with things she didn't want to hear. His car was no longer on the road. The area had been searched, but his body had not been found. Everything stopped for a second. It felt like the room was closing in on her, and she couldn't get her breath. Her mind had screamed, "No, this isn't happening. This can't be happening." It was hard to hear Amina because her voice was so low. "I don't understand," she said. "What do you mean you can't find him?" The other person's voice was a little softer, but the words were still very harsh. "The current may have swept the car into the river, and it's likely that the body was carried away." Amina's knees had given out, and she was lying on the ground clutching the phone like it was her only way out. Kofi was gone in an instant. She knew in her heart that it was not true and that something was wrong. But the official, sad voice on the other end told her that wasn't true. After that, the days had been a blur. The words of strangers and the empty space in her life where Kofi had once been were the only things that helped her understand what had happened. Even though family and friends tried to comfort her, they couldn't find the right words to fill the void he had left. He was gone, and all that was left was the thick silence of their once happy house. Then things got worse just when Amina thought they couldn't get worse. There was a knock on the door to begin with. When she opened it, she saw a man she didn't know. He looked stern and impatient. He asked, "Mrs. Mensah?" Even though it was clear he already knew the answer. "Yes," she answered, not sure what to say. "I'm here to get your husband to pay the debt," she said with a frown. "I don't get it." "What debt?" the man said with a thin, serious smile on his face. "Your husband owed a substantial amount of money to some, let's say, less forgiving lenders. And now, since he's no longer around to pay it, That responsibility falls to you. Amina had a cold. Kofi had never talked about bills. They didn't have a lot of money, but they always got by. She said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I don't have any money. The man's smile was still there. I don't care about that. You'll figure it out, or else with that. He turned and left, leaving Amina standing in the doorway, shocked and scared. It felt like the world was crushing her from every angle. The woman was pregnant, living alone, and owed money that she couldn't pay. The life she had hoped for with Kofi was over, and she was stuck in a nightmare she couldn't get away from. Amina had tried to stay strong for the sake of her future children as the days went by. But it was getting harder and harder to hide the truth about her position. It was getting dark outside, and she was by herself. In the months that followed, Amina's life was filled with fear and exhaustion all the time. The heavy weight of Kofi's debt had taken away from the happiness she used to feel at the thought of becoming a mother. Before, she had no idea how deep he was in. But as the weeks went by, it became painfully clear that she was in way over her head. First, she got calls from cold, unknown people telling her of the money she owed. Her heart would race every time the phone rang, and she would feel fear until she got the courage to answer it. Every time they talked, they made threats and rushed requests for payments she couldn't make. Amina had told them over and over that she didn't have the money. She had said, I'm pregnant, thinking that someone would feel sorry for her. And she said, my husband is gone, and I'm doing my best. But no one heard her. She had been just another deadbeat to them, another name on a list. Every time she hung up the phone, things seemed even worse. It was impossible to escape the banker's pressure. As if the calls weren't scary enough already, they got worse. Men were coming to her door without her knowing. When she carefully opened it, she was met with cold looks and direct reminders of the bill. It was like they were waiting for her to break because they were so close to her. You have a month, one of them told her as they gave her a piece of paper. Get the money, or we'll find another way for you to pay. Amina was shocked as she looked at the paper. The debt was much bigger than she thought it would be. It felt like I was sinking in the ocean and couldn't get out. Each wave was bigger and meaner than the last. The truth about her money problems had hit her harder every time she thought she could catch her breath. She was so broke that she took any job she could find. She cleaned homes, worked late at local diners, and even did odd jobs for neighbors while trying to hide the fact that she was getting bigger. She couldn't have slowed down because of the constant threats against her. But her body, which was tired and worn out, had other ideas. She had trouble seeing one night while cleaning the floors of a small shop in the area. Even though she tried to shake it off, the world around her started to spin. She felt herself shaking and grabbed the counter to settle herself, but it didn't work. Before everything went black, the last thing she remembered was the cold tile floor pulling up to meet her. When Amina woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed while a nurse checked her vital signs. Her hands had gone to her stomach out of reflex because she was so scared. When the nurse saw that she was upset, she put a comforting hand on her arm. She had said in a soft voice, "Your babies are fine, but you're pushing yourself too hard. You need to rest, take a break." It felt like the word was a mean joke. She couldn't rest because everything in her life was falling apart. But what the nurse said kept going through her mind. Amina knew she needed to be careful. She wasn't fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for her 3 kids. Amina had to cut back on her hours because she had no other choice. This made things worse. More and more bills were coming due faster than she could pay them, and the lender's threats got worse. She sold what little valuable she had, but it didn't bring in much money. Everything she had worked for seemed to have gone into debt, leaving her with nothing. The stress was too much to handle. She would sometimes lie awake at night and stare at the ceiling, wondering how she would make it through another day. Thoughts of bad things were going through her head like dark shadows in the night. She had felt stuck and like she was drowning because of how things were. However, every time she felt like giving up, she thought of her kids. They were all she had left of Kofi, and she couldn't leave them, even though he had left her with this mess. They were the only thing that kept her going when things got dark. Amina was really tired by the time her twins were born. It had been months since she had a moment of peace when she held them in her arms and felt their little fingers on hers. She made a promise in that hospital room, which was very quiet. She would always look out for them. She would stay alive no matter what, even if it meant giving up everything she had. But the real world was waiting for her outside the hospital doors. While she was in the hospital, nothing had changed in the world. The lenders were still there, waiting for their money. Things were even worse for Amina now that she had 2 kids to take care of. Fear, which used to be a low hum in the background, was now a steady roar in her ears. Weeks had turned into months, and Amina's life had been a blur of late nights and long, hard days at work. Now that they were crawling and laughing, her twins were the only good things in her otherwise bad life. Even though they smiled and laughed, they knew there was always a threat over their heads. Amina didn't understand something had to change until a really bad day, when the phone rang again with another bill demand. She couldn't live in fear and wait for the next knock on the door any longer. She had to find a way out. It wasn't a lifesaver that finally came through when the chance did. It was a chance to go on a fancy trip. A tough job that would pay just enough to settle the bill that had been bothering her for years. She had no choice but to take it because it was her only choice. The weight on Amina's shoulders hadn't gone away after 7 years. It had even gotten heavy. The twins, Kwame and Ajoa, were 7 years old and full of life. They had bright eyes and didn't know about the danger that had always been there. Amina tried her best to keep them from realizing how bad things were, but every day felt like a fight she wasn't sure she could win. Even though Amina worked hard at several jobs, she hadn't even come close to paying off her debt. The lenders had been equally persistent as ever. Whenever she missed a payment, which seemed to happen quite often, they would come to her door or call her. As the threats got worse, they could no longer hold back any longer. Amina had times when she was afraid for her life and, even worse, for the safety of her children. Amina knew that she couldn't keep living that way. Her mind was worn out from being afraid all the time, and her body was tired from working too hard for years. The kids had seen the circles under her eyes and how her smile no longer quite reached her eyes, but she couldn't have told them the truth. They thought their mother was strong because she always kept things together, even when it seemed like her whole world was coming apart. After a long shift at the diner, Amina sat in her small apartment one night and looked over the bills that were all over the table. As she looked at the numbers that didn't add up, her hands shook. That was all she had left for rent. There wouldn't have been any money left over for food, let alone the next loan payment. She jumped when someone knocked on the door. Before she even answered, she already knew who it was. The fear in her chest made her heart beat fast as she opened the door just a crack. It was a man who worked for the loans. He was big and had cold eyes that wouldn't warm up no matter how many times she begged for more time. He was the face she had grown to fear because it always made her think of the time. He said, "You're late again," in a flat voice, as if they were talking about something as unimportant as the weather. Amina had said, "I just need a little more time," with a voice that was barely above a whisper. The man's face hadn't changed as he said, "I swear I'll have the money soon, Amina, you've been saying that for years." The boss is sick of waiting. Amina's throat got tight. That meant something to her. People who had crossed these men had never been seen again. She had heard. She had always been able to make just enough to keep them away, but now she didn't have any more choices. She quickly told him, "I have a job lined up to buy herself more time. I start in a few days. It's a good job. I promise I'll know how to pay everything off." His eyelid had gone up, finally showing that he was interested. A job. Doing what Amina asked over and over again. Her hands were sweating. The man seemed to think about what she said for the first time. "It's on a cruise ship. A fancy cruise. I'll be working as a waitress. A cruise, huh? That might work. But you better make sure it does, or we'll come get you. And it won't just be money." Ideation hung heavy in the air. Amina quickly nodded, her heart beating fast in her ears. After the door clicked shut, she could feel her whole body shaking as she watched the man leave. The comfort was only short-lived, but it was enough. She was in so much debt that the job on the cruise was the only way she could get out of it. She could end the nightmare for good if she could save enough money while she was at sea. The days after that were a blur of getting ready. Amina had asked her friend, an old woman named Mama Efua, to watch the babies while she was away. She felt terrible about leaving them, but it was the only way she could make sure they had a future. She had no choice. When she left, Kwame and Ajoa clung to her and wrapped their little arms around her waist. It was like they could tell how hard it was for her to go. "When will you be back, Mama?" Kwame asked, his brown eyes wide with worry. "In a few weeks," Amina said, getting down on her knees to give them a tight hug. "And I promise that things will be better when I get back," Ajoa said. She was always the quieter of the two and just nodded and hid her face in Amina's neck. As Amina pulled away and kissed their foreheads before giving them to Mama Efua, the lump in her throat got bigger. As Amina got on the ship, the scope of what she had been doing began to dawn on her. The trip was meant to save her, but as she looked up at the huge ship, she felt scared. The last time she saw the twins was right after they were born, and she had been away for so long that she felt like something bad was about to happen. The cruise ship looked like a castle on the water. It was white and shiny against the deep blue of the ocean. Guests wearing expensive clothes walked along the deck, smiling and drinking champagne. They had no idea that people like Amina were having a hard time. After putting on her outfit and sitting down with the other staff, her mind was on making as much money as possible. Everything seemed fine for the first few days. She had worked long hours, and her feet hurt at the end of each shift, but the money she was making made it worth it. Her mind was always on her kids, her debt, and the future she was trying to build, so she kept to herself and didn't talk to the other employees. Then, on the fourth day, her world turned upside down as she brought a tray of drinks to a table in a fancy restaurant. Kofi had been sitting at one of the tables in a sharp suit. As Amina looked at the guy at the table, her heart was pounding so hard that she couldn't move. She thought for a moment that her mind was messing with her. He couldn't have done it. It could not have been. Kofi passed away 7 years ago. He had left her to fix things, take care of their kids, and deal with the huge amount of debt that almost ate her up. But he was there, alive and more than alive. He looked polished, with his hair pulled back and his suit clean and expensive. He sat there with a casual confidence that made Amina's stomach turn. There was a beautiful woman next to him with dark hair that flowed freely and a smile that made him feel good. She laughed softly at something Kofi said while putting her hand on his. It got really hard for Amina to hold onto the tray she was holding. Her fingers turned white. She had a lot on her mind as she tried to figure out what she was seeing. What could have caused this to happen? She thought for a moment that she might pass out in the middle of the restaurant because her knees felt weak. A voice yelled, "Amina, table 6," and woke her up. Someone in the senior wait staff had gently pushed her toward a different group of people who were also waiting for their drinks. She was shaking so badly that she couldn't give the drinks, but her mind was racing. She couldn't have talked to him there, at that time, but how could she not? She needed to know something. She had been sitting next to the man who had disappeared from her life, and whose body had never been found. He was still alive and well. What did that mean? Did he stay hidden the whole time? Why did he leave her? As soon as her shift was over, Amina ran back to her small shack. She was so shocked that her hands were shaking as she tried to think about what she had just seen. Kofi. He was there, sitting there like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't broken her whole world. Her mind was full of questions, but none of them had answers. But one thing was clear: she had to talk to him about it. She had to understand what was going on. That night, she practiced what she was going to say as she walked around the deck while she waited for the restaurant to close. The time had finally come, and she saw him leave with that same woman on his arm. All of her planned words had gone away. Instead, she had been moving forward just because she felt like it. She could hear her heart beating as she crossed in front of him. "Kofi," she said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. When he turned to face her, he stopped in his tracks and his body turned stiff. When they looked at each other for a split second, there was something in his eyes that looked like recognition or even guilt, but it was gone just as fast. He had blinked, and his face had hardened into a fake smile. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was calm and quiet. "Do I know you?" Amina asked. Her heart had stopped. He had been trying to hide it. He was living and standing right in front of her, but he was acting like he didn't know her. While she was angry, her jaw had tightened. 7 years of pain and uncertainty had come to the surface. "You know who I am," she hissed as she stepped closer. Her eyes were burning with anger and shock. "Don't you dare act like you don't," he said. The woman next to him looked confused as she looked back and forth between them. Kofi, what is this? Who is she? Amina asked. Kofi sighed and looked at her, and her eyes got narrow. He had told her straight out, "You must be wrong." He started to walk away, but Amina wouldn't let him get away that easily. "I don't know you. Please excuse us, we have another dinner reservation." He turned around to face her after she grabbed his arm. The woman next to him let out a gasp, and Kofi's eyes got darker. For a moment, his calm exterior came off. Amina asked, "How could you do this?" Her voice had broken as she spoke. "Why did you leave me? I thought you were dead. I had to raise our kids by myself. I had to deal with everything you left behind, and you've been." What? Living this life with her? Kofi's jaw had clenched, and Amina thought for a split second that she saw sorrow in his eyes. He then yanked his arm away from her, his face getting tougher. He had told her, "You don't know what you're talking about. And if you don't leave us alone, I'll call the police," she said. Amina stared at him, and her heart broke all over again. She was ready to scream, cry, and hit him until he told her the truth. But something about his words and the way he stood told her that wasn't going to happen, not now. Not tonight. He hadn't planned to say anything. As she stepped back, her hands were shaking as she took a big breath. The woman next to Kofi grabbed his arm and pulled him closer, as if to protect him from the trouble Amina had caused that night. But Amina wasn't even close to being done. She said, "Fine," in a low, steady voice. "You can lie all you want, but I know the truth, and I'm not going to let you off the hook." Kofi looked into her eyes for a long time, and the tension between them was high. After that, he turned around and walked away, holding the woman's arm. It made Amina's chest tight with a mix of anger and sadness as she watched them disappear into the crowd. You could hear the sound of the waves hitting the ship as she stood there on the deck by herself. Kofi, the man she loved and who had given birth to her children, was no longer there. Someone different had been there in his place, someone who had faked their own death and then left her to clean up the mess. Amina wasn't going to let him off the hook, though. Not now. Not after everything he made her go through. She had made it this far and this long, and she wasn't going to give up now. The cruise's next few days went by so quickly. Amina had been thinking about Kofi all the time during her shifts, making her move like a ghost. Every time she thought about that moment on the deck, she felt angry and sad at the same time. Why did he leave her? How could he have left their kids, pretended to die, and started a new life with that woman? She didn't even know who she was madder at him for leaving her and the twins, or herself for still feeling that hunger and the empty spot in her chest where her love for him used to be. She caught a peek of him every day on the ship, laughing with his new friend. Their lives were so different from the ones they used to share on land, and each time she saw him, it made the knife stick even more. She needed to know the truth quickly. At the end of her job one night late at night, Amina had made up her mind. She could not hold out any longer. It was time for her to talk to him again, away from the guests and the woman who was clinging to his arm like he was the center of her world. Amina knew where he had been staying. At the beginning, she had seen the room arrangements. As she stood in the dark hallway outside of his door, she felt her heart race with fear and excitement. She took a deep breath and knocked. There was a long pause, and Amina thought for a moment that he wasn't going to answer. He might have been asleep or ignoring her, hoping she would go away. The door then creaked open, and he was there. Kofi stood in the doorway with the same carefully made mask of indifference on his face that he had worn the first night they saw each other. "What do you want, Amina?" he asked in a flat, almost bored voice. She tried to hold back her tears by swallowing hard. "Kofi, I deserve to know the truth." He let out a sigh, moved out of the way, and waved for her to come in. After a moment of hesitation, the weight of what she was about to hear hit her hard. But she went inside anyway, and the door softly shut behind her. The suite was very fancy, very different from the small room she had shared with the other staff members. The living room was big, with soft furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the water. At night, the moonlight gave the room a golden glow. The life Kofi had always wanted was one of comfort and ease, with no responsibilities to weigh him down. He motioned for her to sit down, but she stood there with her arms crossed, as if she was trying to protect herself from the mental attack she knew was coming. Kofi walked over to the window and stared out at the water that went on forever. The soft hum of the ship's engines and the steady crash of the waves were the only sounds for a long time. He finally spoke, but his voice was low and sad. Amina tightened her hands and said, "You know, I didn't plan it." "What didn't you plan?" "Leaving me? Leaving your kids?" Faking your death, he turned to face her and his face got a little softer. "It wasn't supposed to go this way, but things got complicated, Amina asked, her voice rising as she swore in anger. "Kofi, I thought you were dead because you disappeared. We had a funeral for you and I raised our kids by myself because I thought you were dead. And all this time you were running away? Living this other life?" He jerked when she said that, and his shoulders dropped a little. "I was really in trouble, Amina. I owed a lot of money, and the debts weren't going away. I didn't know what to do, so when the chance came up and that accident happened, it was something I took." Amina felt like the ground was moving under her. "You took it? You mean you saw a chance to leave and just left us?" she asked. He sighed, but the sadness in his eyes didn't make her feel better. "Yes. I thought it had been the only way. I thought if I faked my death, I could get away from the debt, start over. And you didn't think about us." Amina's voice had trembled. "You didn't think about how we would stay alive. What about your kids?" "I did," Kofi replied, his voice cracking a little. As Amina shook her head, she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I thought about it every day, but I didn't see a way out. I was scared. I was in so deep, and the pressure was crushing me. So I left us to clean up the mess you made. Do you know what I've been through? What I've had to do to keep our kids safe and pay off your debts?" He looked down at the ground. "I know, and I'm sorry," Amina asked. Her laugh was sour, like years of pain had been holding her back. "That's all you have to say?" "You're sorry?" Kofi asked, running his hand through his hair to show how angry he was. "Amina, what do you want me to say?" "I messed up. I made a mistake. But I can't change the past." She looked at him blankly. It had been years since she had thought about this moment and what she would say if she saw him again. As soon as she got there, though, she felt betrayed more than anything else. And what about her? Amina had gestured toward the door, referring to the woman he had been with. Was she part of the plan too? Kofi had hesitated, and that had been all the answer Amina had needed. "I see," she had whispered, her heart sinking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he had said softly, but the words had felt hollow. Amina had stood there, staring at the man she had once loved, the father of her children, and had realized that the Kofi she had known had been gone. He had been replaced by someone she hadn't recognized, someone who had made choices that had shattered their lives. She had taken a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You may have escaped your debt, Kofi, but you won't escape this. I'm not going to let you walk away from what you did." And with that, she had turned and walked out of the suite, leaving Kofi standing alone, his reflection lost in the glass. Back in her cramped cabin, Amina had sat on the edge of the small bed, her mind racing with the conversation that had just unfolded. The truth had been out. Kofi had left her and their children, faked his death. And now he had been living a life of luxury with a woman who had probably had no idea of the mess he had left behind. Her heart had still pounded in her chest, her hands shaking from the fight. But now that the shock had worn off, something new had begun to take root: determination. She had spent years struggling to survive, working herself to the bone for the twins, all while carrying the burden of Kofi's betrayal. She had given everything, and yet here he had been, walking away from his responsibilities as if none of it had ever happened. It hadn't been fair, and she hadn't been going to let him get away with it. Kofi had always been good at hiding his true self. He had been able to charm anyone, make them believe he had been someone worth trusting. But Amina had known the truth now, and with the truth had come power. She had had something he hadn't expected: knowledge. She had known what he had done, how he had abandoned them. And worse, he had done it to run from debt that had been crushing her and threatening the safety of their children. For the first time in years, Amina had felt a rush of power. She hadn't been going to be the victim anymore. She hadn't been going to let Kofi's choices dictate her life. It was time to fight back. The next morning, she had lost no time. Her first step had been gathering as much information as she could. She started with the ship's guest books, which were easy for staff members to get to when they needed to know who the visitors were. There it was in black and white, Kofi's new name. Even though he had changed his last name and become someone else, to Amina he was still the guy who had ruined everything. Next, she went to the staff break room for a quiet moment to learn more about his friend. Claudia, the woman, had planned the ship as part of a fancy vacation. It was written that she and Kofi were married. She felt sick when she thought about how they had built their life on lies. It was clear to Amina that she couldn't face Kofi directly again without a plan. Dealing with lenders for years taught her that staying alive wasn't just about being strong, it was also about having a plan. She should have been smart about this. If she had gone to the police, she would have needed proof. If she had gone to the lenders, she would have had to make sure they weren't after her or the twins. After her shift that night, she went to the ship's operations center. An old friend from her town who had worked in investigations for years was the only person she knew who could have helped her. He hadn't always followed the rules, but Amina didn't care. She had to find someone quickly who could find something bad about Kofi. She sent Kofi a private message telling him what she had learned about him, his new name, and the life he had been living. She had asked for any information that could connect him to his old bills or, even better, any proof that he had done something wrong. The person she talked to replied right away. Amina got an answer a few hours later that made her blood run cold. Not only was Kofi running away from debt, he was also part of a huge scam that targeted a rich businessman in their hometown. It was an easy plan: put on a fake death, disappear, and let Amina handle the mess. Before he left, he emptied their accounts, leaving her with nothing. There had been more, though. The person she was talking to gave her proof, including bank payments, fake contracts, and even emails between Kofi and his helpers. The information was very bad. If Amina had told the police about this, Kofi would have been in trouble with the law and not just with bill collectors. He would have been sent to jail. She could feel the weight of what she was holding in her hand as she scrolled through the files. That was it. She was going to get her life back this way. She could have gotten out of debt and made sure Kofi paid for everything with these papers. But there was still the question of the loans. It was clear to Amina that they could have come after her after Kofi was gone if she hadn't been careful. Because they had already shown how cruel they could be, she couldn't risk putting her kids in even more danger. It was important for her to get them involved without becoming their next target. She had a clear moment when she knew the answer. She could have used Kofi's debt against him if she had given him to the lenders before calling the police. She could have agreed to keep herself safe in exchange for giving Kofi to them. There was no reason for them to care who paid as long as they got their money. Even though it was risky, it was the only plan that made sense. She wasn't sure that the police could handle this quickly enough. The lenders knew different people, so if anyone could have found Kofi and made him pay, it would have been them. Now that Amina had the proof, she felt like she had a new reason to live. She wasn't the same person she used to be. 7 years ago, they were scared and broken. She was tougher and stronger now, and she wasn't going to let Kofi ruin her life any longer. The call was made by her. The call was short and to the point. Amina told the bankers what was going on and made sure that her words made it clear that she wasn't against them. It wasn't like she was running away. She was giving away something much more valuable than money, though. It was time for Kofi to face the effects of his lies. He had gotten away with them for too long. The man on the other end of the line, who she had only ever dealt with through middlemen, had been quiet while she spoke. She knew his voice would be low and cold, because it was exactly that. But there was a pause when she talked about Kofi and the proof she had. He asked in a sharper voice, "Are you telling me you can give us the man who owes us millions?" "Yes," Amina said, her voice steady even though the back of her neck was tingling with fear. "I know where he is, what crimes he did, and how he's been living under a different name. I can give you all the information you need to find him." The other end of the line was silent for a long time. She could almost hear the wheels turning in his head as he thought about her offer. Amina knew she was putting herself in danger, but she had no other choice. They might have gotten angry with her if she hadn't handled this correctly. Even worse, they might have turned their attention to her children. The man finally spoke up again. "And what do you want in return?" he asked. "My safety," she answered, her voice steady. "I've been paying off his debt for years. I want that debt to go away and for good. Get Kofi and all the money he owes you, but let me go free." There was another pause. No more threats, no more visits as Amina waited for his answer. Her heart was racing, and she prayed that what she did was the right thing to do. Things couldn't have gone wrong because she didn't have enough money. The man finally said, "All right," but this time his voice was colder than before. She said, "But if you're lying or this is some kind of trick, you'll feel bad about it." "I'm not lying," Amina replied quickly, her voice strong. "I'll send you the papers tonight. You'll see for yourself that it's all real." He didn't say anything else before hanging up, leaving Amina to deal with the consequences of what she had just done. She had been shaking as she looked at her phone. It was done. The call was made by her. It was too late to go back now. Later that night, she put all the proof her friend had sent her into a safe file. This included the bank records, emails, and fake contracts. She sent everything to the lenders, along with information about where Kofi was on the ship and what his new name was. It was all there was no doubt about it. After sending the message, Amina fell asleep on her bed, her body heavy with tiredness. The stress of the past few days had finally caught up with her. For some reason, though, knowing that she had done something made her feel better. Not only was she living, but she was also fighting back for the first time in years. It was business as usual for Amina on the ship the next morning, but there was a feeling of stress in the air. Even though she tried to keep her head down and fit in with the other staff, her heart would skip a beat every time she saw a guest she didn't know or a group of security guards. The hardest part was having to wait. It had been hours and nothing had changed. Amina started to wonder if the lenders got her message, if they were planning something, or if she had completely messed up her math. She was getting less and less sure of herself, and she couldn't stop checking her phone, hoping to see some sign that her plan had worked. Then, just after noon, she had seen something. There was a quick rush of movement close to the main deck. A security guard was quietly moving through the crowd, and she saw one of the top officers going toward where Kofi was staying in the VIP rooms. Her heart rate had gone up. That was it. Following far behind, Amina was careful not to be seen. They had gone to Kofi's room and knocked on the door, which she saw. It looked like time had stopped for a moment. The door then opened, and 2 guards came in. Even though she couldn't see Kofi's face, she could only think how shocked and scared he must have been when they told him his time was up. Soon after, Kofi came out with 2 security guards on either side of him. His face was a mix of surprise and anger. It was Amina who saw the flash of recognition in his eyes as they led him through the ship. He knew. He knew she was the one who did this. He had not struggled or tried to run. As if he still had some control over the situation, he had just walked along with them with his head held high. Amina knew better, though. It was over for him. He had finally been caught for his lies and betrayals. As they led him off the ship, Amina hid and watched from afar. She could feel her breath getting caught in her throat as the truth of the situation hit her. As soon as Kofi left, the heavy weight of the past 7 years began to lift. It was over with the debt, the fear, and the never-ending fight to stay alive. It was her fault. She was once again in charge of her life. Amina felt relieved, but she knew that this wasn't the end. Still, there were pieces to put back together and scars to heal. Plus, there was the matter of Claudia, Kofi's partner in crime, who had also been involved in the lie. But she had given herself a moment of success for now. Amina knew she was strong enough to handle whatever came next now that the hardest part was over. From behind, Amina saw Kofi being led off the ship with his head held high. She could tell he was tense because of the tightness in his jaw and the way he stood. He had been trying to stay in charge and keep up appearances, but he couldn't get away from what was happening. She had a strange mix of feelings as she watched him: relief, satisfaction, and even a small, bitter sadness for the man she had loved and thought she knew. That man was gone, though. Someone else had been there in his place, and they had lied to her, hurt her, and left their kids. She knew it was only a matter of time before the lenders made their move as the security team led him to a car waiting on the dock. She didn't think they would do anything nice with him once they had him. Kofi dug his own hole, and he was now going to lie down in it. But there was still one loose end: Claudia. Amina had seen her on the ship with Kofi. laughing and having a good time. They had no idea that a storm was coming. Claudia wasn't just a spectator, she had known Kofi for years, and Amina thought she knew more than she told her. Claudia had to have had something to do with Kofi's disappearance because he could not have done it on his own. Although Kofi had been taken away, Amina thought it was time for one last fight. She needed to know what was going on and how involved Claudia was right away. Claudia was still on board, unaware of the chaos that was about to happen. The cruise wasn't over yet. Late that night, when most of the guests had gone back to their rooms or were enjoying the late-night entertainment, Amina waited. There wasn't much noise on the ship as Amina made her way to Claudia's room. The only sound was the soft hum of the engines. Her hands were shaking a little, but not because she was scared. She was excited. It had been years in the making, but now it was finally here. It took a moment for the door to open after she knocked on it. Claudia had stood there in a beautiful silk robe, her face scrunched up with surprise as she saw Amina. Claudia asked, "Can I help you?" Her voice was smooth and fine, like she didn't care about anything. Amina tried to smile. "Let's talk." Claudia looked over her shoulder to see if anyone else was there. Then she smiled condescendingly at Amina and said, "We need to talk." When asked what the question was about, Amina stepped forward and spoke in a low, strong voice. "About Kofi, about what he's done and what you've been a part of." Claudia's grin had gone away, and her eyes were now a little narrower. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't act stupid," Amina yelled, her anger rising. "You know what I mean. You've been with him for years and lived off the money he stole and the lies he told you he was telling." Claudia's face had changed. The mask of indifference had been lifted just a bit. "If you have problems with Kofi, you should talk to him about them." "I don't know anything about his past," liar, Amina said, moving closer. Her words cut through the silence like a knife. "You knew the whole time. You helped him get away. You knew he left me and his kids with nothing. You knew, and you didn't care." Claudia's eyes had been flickering with something, maybe fear, guilt, or just irritation. With her back against the door, her tone was stern and her arms were crossed. "I didn't know the whole story, okay? He told me you were out of the picture, so he had to leave. I didn't ask any questions." "We were happy." "Happy?" Amina asked again, her voice rising in shock. Claudia's face turned a little pale, but she quickly calmed down. "Happy while I was struggling to feed our children? While I was being threatened, harassed, and forced to pay off his debts." "I didn't know it was that bad," I said. "Didn't know or didn't care?" Amina asked, her eyes bright with anger. "You were too busy living in style to discover what happened to the life he left behind." Claudia flinched, and for the first time she felt less sure of herself. She moved around on her feet and looked around nervously, as if she wanted to get away from the talk. "Listen, I'm sorry for what happened, but Kofi made his own decisions. I wasn't to blame for that." "You were involved," Amina said, her voice calm even though she was angry. "You helped him lie, and now he's paying for it. But don't think you're getting away with it either," she said. Claudia's eyes grew wide with fear. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I've told the police everything," Amina said, her voice cold and serious. "All of Kofi's debts, fraud, and lies have been proven. They know about him and they know about you. It's only a matter of time before they come for you too." The words made Claudia gasp for air. She grabbed the door handle with both hands as a flash of fear crossed her face. "There was no way you could be serious. I didn't do anything wrong. You let him destroy my life," Amina had said, her voice shaking from years of being lied to. "You did nothing but watch while he did it. Yes, I'm serious. And trust me, you won't be able to hide behind Kofi anymore." Claudia was quiet for a moment, her eyes darting around the room, as if she were trying to find a way out of the nightmare. The first time she looked at Amina, she didn't see pride or disdain. Instead, she saw fear. Claudia had whispered, "You're wrong," and her voice was shaking. Amina shook her head and kept her eyes fixed on the ground. "Not at all. The only mistake I made was believing Kofi. But that's over now. And so is this." Amina turned and walked away, leaving Claudia standing alone in the doorway with a pale face and a body that didn't move. As Amina walked back to her cabin, the stress of everything she had done started to fade. Kofi was gone, and Claudia would be leaving soon. She was finally getting over the past that had been bothering her for years. Amina felt free for the first time in a long time. Early the next morning, Amina woke up to the steady hum of the ship's engines under her bedroom. The events of the night before had seemed far away, like a dream, but they became real very quickly. Kofi had been taken away from the ship. Claudia had probably been scared because she knew that her easy life was about to fall apart. What about Amina? Amina was finally free from the weight that had been suffocating her for so long. She felt better after a while of being tense, and she could breathe deeply for the first time in what seemed like forever without fear mounting inside her. It was her fault. She took charge of her life, faced the guy who had hurt her, and did what the law required of him. She didn't get the closure she had hoped for, but she did get the closure she needed. A soft knock on her door had stopped her in her tracks as she was getting ready for the day. Amina's heart had skipped a beat, and she had a lot of thoughts going through her head. She didn't know what to expect, but she wasn't scared anymore. She opened the door after taking a big breath. She was shocked to find out that it wasn't a crew member or a lender's agent. Instead, it was the ship's security officer, the same person she had seen leading Kofi off the ship. He asked, "Ms. Mensa," with a serious but not mean look on his face. Even though Amina had become stronger, she said yes. "That's me," with a hint of worry in her voice. The cop began by fixing his cap and saying, "I thought you'd like to know." Mr. Mensa, well, the man you identified as Kofi Mensa was taken into custody without incident. He's being transported to local authorities, and from what I understand, they'll be pursuing criminal charges. There's quite a lot of evidence stacked against him. Amina nodded, her heart racing. The officer smiled and said, "Thank you for letting me know. I wasn't sure what would happen after they took him off the ship. I've seen a lot in my time, but people like him never get away with it. It was only a matter of time." "You did the right thing by coming forward." Amina wasn't ready for the emotional wave that hit her when he spoke those words. They weren't relieved or even happy, they were just tired. Like you get after fighting for years and keeping it all together for that long. She had to lean against the door frame for a moment to keep herself steady because her knees felt weak. The police officer saw. Amina forced a smile as she answered, "Are you okay, Miss Mensa?" they said. "I will be. It's been a long time coming." The officer tipped his hat and smiled. "I see what you mean. Please take care of yourself, okay?" "Thank you, you've been through a lot," she said as she softly shut the door behind him. She leaned against it, and the weight of everything hit her like a heavy blanket. Finally, Kofi was going to pay for what he had done, for leaving her to pay the bill, for lying about his death, and for giving up on her. It was over. There was still a strange void where her anger had once been so strong after a few minutes had passed. She had been driven for years by betrayal and the need to keep her kids safe and stay alive. She didn't know what to do next now that that weight was off her shoulders. After a short time, Amina went to the window of her small house and looked out at the huge ocean. The sun had danced on the waves, and the sky in front of her seemed to go on forever. Even though it was peaceful and beautiful, it felt like the beginning of the end of her trip. She had worked so hard to stay alive, and now she had to figure out how to live again. It was Kwame and Ajoa that had been on her mind, the reason she had kept going all those years. They gave her hope when things looked the worst and gave her a reason to get up every day and keep going, even when it seemed impossible. Now she had the chance to give them the life they earned, one without fear, debt, or the memory of their father's betrayal. It was time to return home. Amina got her few things together and went to the gangway as soon as the ship docked in the busy port city that afternoon. All of the noise in the port, the shouts of dock workers, the rumble of trucks, and the clatter of bags being unloaded had been too much for Amina to handle. Her main goal had been to get back to her kids. It was planned that Mama Efua would pick her up at the port and take her home. She felt warm inside whenever she thought about seeing her kids again. It had been years since she had felt that way. It had been a long time since she had been going back to them without fear and doubt hanging over her. As she got off the ship, she saw Mama Efua's old, familiar car sitting next to the curb. The old woman in the driver's seat waved at Amina as she came up behind her. A smile spread across her worn-out face. Amina felt so thankful that her heart grew. During the worst times, Mama Efua was her rock. She helped her care for the twins when it seemed impossible. Welcome back, dear Mama Efua said with a smile as Amina got into the passenger seat. After a short pause, Amina asked, how was the trip? Her eyes had been drawn to the city outside the window. She finally said it was complicated with a small smile on her face. But it's over now, Mama Efua said, giving Amina a soft pat on the hand. That's great to hear. The twins will be overjoyed to see you. Since you left, they haven't stopped talking about you. Amina felt a lump in her throat when she thought of her kids. I really missed them. The rest of the drive was peaceful and quiet, and they soon got to the small apartment building where Amina lived. Her heart was racing with excitement as she got out of the car. Kwame and Ajoa would have been inside waiting for her. When they saw her, they would have been thrilled. It made her want to hold them and tell them everything was going to be okay almost right away. She could finally believe it for the first time in 7 years. After getting out of the car, Amina walked toward the apartment building. The brick front was a sight she was happy to see. As she went up the stairs, her mind was full of Kwame and Ajoa, which made her heart beat fast. It had taken 7 years of hard work, sleepless nights, and constant fear to get to that point. She was coming home, really coming home this time, because she knew the past was behind her. She could hear weak giggles coming from inside her apartment before she even got to the door. She smiled and put her hand on the doorknob for a moment, enjoying the thrill of the wait. After taking a big breath, she opened the door. What she saw when she got there made her heart race. Kwame, Ajoa, and Mama Efua were sitting on the floor with a bunch of toys and coloring books all around them. The twins looked up at the same time, and as soon as they saw her, their eyes lit up with joy. Kwame yelled, "Mama," and ran toward her, jumping up and down. Ajoa wasn't far behind, and her happy face was shining. When the twins slammed into Amina, she fell to her knees with her arms wide open. The force of their hugs almost knocked her over. She had put her arms around them and pulled them close. Her heart hurt from happiness and relief at the same time. After a long time of dreaming about it, she finally got to hold them without being scared. Amina whispered, "I missed you both so much," and she kissed the tops of their heads. Her voice was full of emotion. "We missed you too," Mama Ajoa said, putting her little hands on Amina's shirt tightly as if she was afraid she would run away again. Before giving Amina a warm smile, Mama Efua slowly stood up and stretched her stiff back. "They've been wondering about you every day. They'll be glad to hear you're back for good now," Amina nodded, holding on to her kids. "Thank you, Mama Efua. I don't know what I would have done without you." The older woman waved her hand away, but her eyes were so full of love that they shone. "Don't worry about it. What matters is that you're okay," Mama Efua said. Amina smiled, but Mama Efua could tell there was something heavy in her face. The old woman came over and lightly tapped Amina on the shoulder. "All right, I'll leave you to your reunion. You deserve some time with these little ones." Mama Efua then picked up her things and walked toward the door, stopping only once to give Amina one last encouraging nod. "Don't ever forget that you're a strong woman, Amina." Stronger than most as the door shut behind her, Amina sat back down on the floor with Kwame and Ajoa, losing herself in their laughs and hugs. She felt like she could finally breathe for the first time in years. It was like the heavy weight that had been sitting on her chest was rising. They played with toys, colored, and told stories with each other for the rest of the afternoon. As she watched her kids, Amina felt a sense of wonder. She realized how much she had missed while she had been working hard to protect them. It was so hard for her to stay alive, with all the debt and fear, that she missed those little moments that meant the most. Amina put Kwame and Ajoa to bed as the sun went down and the sky turned pink and orange. As she read them their favorite bedtime story, they were both tired and had droopy eyes. Kwame had laid next to Ajoa with his eyes barely open, listening to his mother's calm words. Ajoa had curled up under her blanket and held her stuffed animal. Kwame had asked over and over, "Are you really staying home this time?" Mama, his small voice had broken the silence. The question hurt Amina's heart. She bent down and gave him a soft kiss on the face. It was Kwame who said, good, his eyes closing slowly as he fell asleep. "Yes, sweetie. I'm home for good." No more leaving. Ajoa was already asleep, and the room was filled with her soft snores. Amina had been watching her kids for a moment, and her heart was full of love and peace. They were risk-free. They were safe now. She quietly left the room and shut the door behind her. Amina then went into the living room and sat down on the worn-out couch. Even though the room was simple and small, it felt like home. It had been theirs, and Amina didn't feel trapped in her own life for the first time in years. She could start over and make a new life for herself and her kids. They were free. But the weight of the past was still there in the background of her mind. Even though Kofi was no longer with her, she couldn't forget how he had betrayed her and how hard things had been for years. She had made it through, but now she had to learn how to live again, how to start over without always being afraid of what was around the corner. She knew it wasn't going to be possible. There were deep scars, and there were still hard days to come. Still, Amina had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time as she sat there in the quiet apartment. She felt hope. She didn't have all the answers yet, but that was enough for now. Over the next few days, Amina got used to her new routine. Still, things were not going well in her life. She had to pay her bills, buy food, and raise her 2 active 7-year-olds by herself. But now it felt different, somewhat lighter. There was no longer the constant fear that everything would fall apart at any time because Kofi had betrayed her. There were also no longer debt collectors knocking on her door. That was the first time she could think about her future and the future of her children without the past getting in the way. While Amina was sitting at the small kitchen table one night, she thought about everything that had led her to that point. The world knew about Kofi's crimes after he was caught and put in jail. It depends on how bad his scam was that he could have spent years or even a lifetime in jail. Who is Claudia? Amina had lost track of where she was, but it didn't matter anymore. She did what she needed to do. Even as she sipped her tea, she felt like things were finally over. She was no longer with the man who had hurt her so much. It was time to let go and start over. The next morning, Amina woke up early. The sun was coming in through the blinds, and she could hear the noise of the city outside. The sound of Kwame and Ajoa laughing in their room made her smile. What mattered now were those times, those easy, beautiful moments. To stay alive, she had spent so many years that she had forgotten how to live. Now, though, she had the chance to make things better for herself and her kids, and she wasn't going to miss it. Aminia took the twins for a walk to the nearby park after breakfast. Everyone in the park was out and about on that sunny, warm day. Families, couples, and kids were all running through the grass. While they played, Kwame and Ajoa ran off to the swings, and their laughter filled the air. Amina had watched them with a steady, quiet joy in her heart. After sitting on a bench for a while, she took in the peaceful scene. She didn't feel like she was always waiting for the next bad thing to happen for the first time in years. On the edge, ready for something bad to happen, she hadn't always felt that way. There was no fear there. All she could hear was her kids laughing, and she could feel the sun on her skin. She thought about all the things she had learned in the last 7 years as she watched them. She had learned that being strong meant more than just staying alive. It meant finding a way to keep going even when it seemed impossible. It was about standing up for what was important and protecting the people you loved, even when you didn't know everything. She also learned that letting go was the hardest but most important thing to do sometimes. Kofi had been a part of her life for a long time. He had been the man she loved, the man who had cheated on her, and finally the man she beat. But now that he was gone, she was free to build a new future without the ghosts of the past disturbing her. From morning until night, Amina thought less and less about what had happened with Kofi and more about the day ahead of her. It looked like there would be a lot of good things happen. She wasn't sure where her life would go next, but she was excited to find out for the first time in a long time. After putting Kwame and Ajoa to bed that night, Amina stood by the window of her small apartment and looked out at the city. Amina's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. Her journey of betrayal, loss, and survival reminds us that no matter how dark life becomes, there is always hope. Amina found the courage to fight for herself and her children, to rise from the ashes of her past, and to reclaim her life. Her determination to confront the truth, despite the immense pain, shows that we can all find the strength within ourselves to keep moving forward. Life may throw unexpected challenges our way, but like Amina, we must believe that brighter days lie ahead. To anyone facing hardship, remember that you are stronger than you realize, And with faith and resilience, you can overcome any obstacle. Please like, share, and support this powerful story if you want to see part 2. Let's aim for 5,000 likes to continue Amina's journey and inspire others with her incredible story of strength and survival.